Today's hearing of the Congressional Executive Commission on China on Tibet, barriers to settling an unresolved conflict will come to order. More than 70 years after the invasion that led to Chinese rule in Tibet, Tibetans continue to struggle in the face of unrelenting opposition. Chinese authorities routinely violate Tibetans' freedoms of religion, expression, and assembly, as well as denying Tibetans self-determination. The Chinese Communist Party has waged a years-long campaign of Sinicization, requiring conformity with officially sanctioned interpretations of religion and culture, not the authentic practice and teaching of Tibetan Buddhism. Contrary to that practice and teaching, the Chinese government even insists on its own authority to select the next reincarnation of the Dalai Lama, who authorities label a security threat. Those who express reverence to the Dalai Lama are punished. Also punished are those who express dissatisfaction with Chinese rule in Tibet. These punishments range from warnings to surveillance to interrogation and detention.
And the Tibetan people must be free to practice their own faith and to choose their own spiritual leaders. And again, we look forward to our distinguished witnesses for giving us guidance on the path forward. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman. And we'd now like to introduce those witnesses. I'll introduce all of them at the beginning. Michael von Walt von Praag is a professor of international law and executive president of CREDA, an international non-governmental organization created to help prevent and resolve violent interstate conflicts. He is the author of Tibet Brief 2020, and he previously served as legal advisor to the office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Han-Xing Lao is a retired professor who taught at the City University of Hong Kong, Oklahoma State University, and Washington State University. Since retiring, he has devoted his time to Chinese history. He is the author of the book, Tibet Was Never Part of China Since Antiquity. Tenzing Taitong is a former Tibetan government official and representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to North America. He served in several roles in the Central Tibetan Administration, including as Kalon Tripa, the equivalent of Prime Minister. He has served as the director of the Tibetan Language Service at Radio Free Asia and is currently the director of the Tibetan Language Service at Voice of America, and he is testifying in his personal capacity. And Ellen Bork will be joining us by Zoom. She is contributing editor at the American Purpose. She previously served as a senior professional staff member for Asia on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and writes frequently about U.S. policy toward Tibet, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Her writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Dispatch, the Washington Post, and other publications. Thank you all for joining us for this hearing, and without objection, your full statements will be entered into the record. We ask that you keep your oral remarks to about 5 minutes. And so we'll start with Michael von Walt von Praag.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My testimony today is based on the findings of 10 years of collaborative research, historical and legal, most of which I carried out during my tenure at the School of Historical Studies of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and the findings are published in these two books. Today, I'd like to call your attention to one of those findings and its international legal ramifications. Contrary to what the PRC claims, Tibet was historically not a part of China. Though not always independent in the modern legal sense of the term, and over the centuries subject to various degrees of Mongol, Manchu, and even British authority or influence, Tibet was never a part of China. The PRC did not inherit Tibet from the Republic of China or from earlier empires as it claims. Tibet was in fact an independent state in the modern sense of the term, in fact and law from 1912 to 1951, when the PRC took it by force. So the PRC's military invasion of Tibet constituted an act of aggression and violated the peremptory norm of international law prohibiting the acquisition of territory by the use of force against another state. And this informs the legitimacy, or not, of China's presence and rule of Tibet. China does not have sovereignty over Tibet, and therefore it is occupying Tibet illegally. That, in turn, informs the international community's legal obligations and its responsibilities regarding the Sino-Tibetan conflict. Governments are prohibited under international law from recognizing China's annexation of Tibet, and they have the positive obligation to help bring about a resolution of the Sino-Tibetan conflict, to end the occupation of Tibet, and to enable the Tibetan people to exercise self-determination. As you stated, it is US policy to support a negotiated resolution to the conflict between China and Tibet. But US government actions run counter to that policy. The US government has stated more than once that it considers Tibet to be a part of the PRC. If it and other governments continue to do so, Beijing no longer will have any incentive to negotiate with the Tibetans. The international community will have satisfied the PRC's needs without Beijing having to make any concessions to the Tibetans. The PRC wants two things above anything else regarding Tibet: legitimacy and no foreign interference or criticism. Beijing's strategy to obtain legitimacy in Tibet from the Tibetans is failing. The Dalai Lama disputes the PRC's only claim to entitlement to Tibet, namely that Tibet has been an integral part of China since antiquity. And he is not giving in to pressure to make a statement to that effect. Beijing has therefore started demanding of other governments that they recognize that Tibet is part of China, and is using their statements as a substitute for true legitimacy. Once a government accepts to regard Tibet as part of the PRC, it also accepts that Tibet and Sino-Tibetan relations are China's internal affair, outside its purview. Beijing's needs are then satisfied, and the Tibetan negotiating power, which depends heavily on the international community's upholding of international law in keeping with Tibet's status as an occupied country, is then severely weakened. And not only that, endorsing China's sovereignty claim to Tibet conditions the Tibetans to envision a settlement that can bring only marginal change in Tibet. Given what we know about China's treatment of Tibetans and also its treatment of Uyghurs, and Beijing's determination to eradicate their very identity, I ask, is marginal change what the US really wants for the Tibetan people? The conflict will not be resolved with marginal change. It can only truly be resolved if the Tibetans' basic needs are satisfied. At a very minimum, this requires a robust autonomy with guarantees and international protection endorsed by the Tibetan people in accordance with their right to self-determination. To arrive there, the international community needs to play its role, uphold international law, treat Tibet as an occupied country, and the conflict as a matter of international responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we'll now turn.
So again, I think that there is a renewed interest in the United States and in other countries around the world. You know, as we witnessed yesterday, talking to parliamentarians from all over the world who are in Washington to find ways to support the Tibetan people. That I think things are changing globally, and I wish they had changed a long time ago, but they're now changing. My time is up right now. I'm going to recognize Senator Ossoff.
Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panelists. I'd like to ask each of our panelists to comment on the intersection of press freedom and the issue at hand today. Last week in the commission, we heard from Undersecretary Zaya, who committed to me to work with my office to expand press freedom internationally and strengthen U.S. leadership for press freedom. My question, please, beginning with you, Mr. Tong, is how does the CCP repress freedom of reporting and publication within Tibet, more broadly within China? How does the CCP seek to influence reporting and publication on related issues internationally?
I don't have anything to add about the press freedom or the lack of it in Tibet. What I would say is that at the same time, China is, in a sense, abusing the freedom of the press internationally outside of China by using the press very actively to project its narrative on Tibet, to project also its vocabulary on Tibet. For example, many members of the press write articles in which they refer to Tibetans as a minority, one of China's minorities, which is an implicit acceptance of Tibet being part of China and the Tibetans being one of China's people's minorities. Whereas, in effect, the Tibetans are not a minority. They are the population of Tibet. They are the people of Tibet, and they are a people under international law with the full right to self-determination. And so that's just one example, but there's so many examples of articles in the press and reports in the press that use Chinese terminology in regard to Tibet.
Congressman, if you could just repeat the crux of your question again, because it kind of went in and out.
So. With the current abuses by CCP to oppress autonomous regions, what should the United States and other countries work together to stand with the Tibet people? And can global corporate companies play a role in raising awareness about the Tibet oppression?
Regarding cooperation among countries, I think it's also very important to emphasize that not only is this of crucial importance for Tibet and the Tibetan people themselves, but this has broader international ramifications because the appeasement of China on Tibet for the past 70 years is not unrelated to China's expansion today or its efforts to expand in the South China Sea, where it uses a similar historical narrative as it does to claim sovereignty over Tibet, and its aggressive stance in relation to northern India, both in the eastern and western part of northern India, and as Annenborg mentioned, even calling one part of northeast India southern Tibet, where it makes territorial claims, again, directly related to its historical narrative of Tibet. So one cannot accept the historical narrative on Tibet and then contest China's claim to northern India, or perhaps even it makes it difficult to contest their claim to the South China Sea islands. And the second question regarding corporations, the only thing I would mention is that, again, under international law, because China is denying the Tibetan people their right to self-determination, which they have, and because it is occupying Tibet, corporations and governments are forbidden from benefiting from the exploitations of resources in Tibet, because those resources, under international law, belong to the Tibetan people. And therefore, they cannot be exploited, one cannot benefit from it without the express permission of the Tibetan people given freely. Thank you.
Van Walt, your testimony addresses the concept of self-determination as core to your thesis. Can you discuss the gap, if any, between the basis of the right to self-determination in international law and the extent to which governments honor and protect that right? And how would you respond to those who say Tibetans are not entitled to self-determination?
Thank you very much for the question. Self-determination under international law is a basic right. It is both a basic right and it is codified in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in its very first article, because there is a recognition, and there was a recognition when those two conventions were written, that without honoring the right to self-determination, many of the other human rights are difficult to conceive of and to respect. And therefore it is dependent to some degree on respecting the right to self-determination. But self-determination is also a fundamental principle of international relations, as many UN declarations make clear that respect for the right to self-determination is a fundament of friendly relations among states. And so both these things are truly fundamental. At the same time, self-determination as it has developed was for a long time considered to be primarily a right of countries to decolonize from Western colonialism, but increasingly it is being recognized that when we're speaking about colonialism, we're speaking about the nature of rule, the nature of the relationship between a dominant power and a subjugated country, a subjugated people under alien domination. And regardless of whether it is a Western power, regardless of whether there is an ocean between the, if you like, the cosmopolitan country and the colony, colonialism is about the nature of relations and exploitation. Under that concept, Tibet very clearly is under colonial rule today. And I think it should be recognized that way. The PRC just introduced this at an earlier session of the Human Rights Council in Geneva, a resolution on the continuing, and I don't know the exact words, but something like the continuing consequences of colonialism. Even within that context, we should be using colonialism to address the situation in Tibet. Aside from colonialism, Tibetans also, because they are a people under any definition in international law of a people with the right to self-determination, Tibetans fit squarely in that category. In terms of the difference between, in other words, their right to full self-determination and the honoring of that internationally, there is, I think, a big gap. In the 1950s and 60s, a number of countries, including the United States, recognized and supported the Tibetan people's right to self-determination. And as you know, there is a United Nations General Assembly resolution on that subject in 1960 that recognizes the Tibetans' right to self-determination and calls on for its respect and for its implementation. So Tibetans have had that recognition internationally. The discrepancy is that today many countries, probably most countries, do not refer to the Tibetan people's right to self-determination anymore, simply out of fear of displeasing China. And I think it is very important to restore the situation to where it was universally recognized that Tibetans had the right to self-determination.
Thank you. You're still on the line, but do you have additional questions?
No,
or?
I don't.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I just stopped to listen.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Benwald, what other governments have made statements about Tibet being part of China? I mean, how many also say since ancient times? Can you provide examples of how the Chinese narrative has been embraced by the international community?
I can't give you exact numbers of how many governments have and how many governments have not. I know that some governments, and I know that because I've spoken to their officials, have been very careful not to make any explicit statements, despite pressure. Others have been pressured, especially after, for example, somebody high up in the government, the Minister of Foreign Affairs or the Prime Minister, has received His Holiness the Dalai Lama. After that, they're subjected to a tremendous amount of pressure, and a number of them then make a statement to the effect that they recognize or that they identify Tibet as a part of the PRC. A good example of that is France, which after President Sarkozy, in his capacity of President of the European Union, met with His Holiness in Poland, France was put under a lot of pressure and made a statement that since the time of Charles de Gaulle, France recognized that Tibet was a part of China, which is actually not true, or not accurate, I should say. But that is an example, and that the statement continues by saying, and this will not change. Denmark was pressured to make a similar statement, and Denmark added that the Danish government does not support Tibetan independence. A little bit in the same way as President Obama added that statement as well. I think that addition is even more harmful and completely unnecessary. It takes away and violates the Tibetans' right to self-determination to say that they cannot have any say in their future because we do not support a particular outcome. And again, it reduces the leverage for Tibetans should negotiations take place, this type of statement.
Mr. Van Walt, what other governments have made statements about Tibet being part of China? I mean, how many also say since ancient times? Can you provide examples of how the Chinese narrative has been embraced by the international community?
I can't give you exact numbers of how many governments have and how many governments have not. I know that some governments, and I know that because I've spoken to their officials, have been very careful not to make any explicit statements, despite pressure. Others have been pressured, especially after, for example, somebody high up in the government, the Minister of Foreign Affairs or the Prime Minister, has received His Holiness the Dalai Lama. After that, they're subjected to a tremendous amount of pressure, and a number of them then make a statement to the effect that they recognize or that they identify Tibet as a part of the PRC. A good example of that is France, which after President Sarkozy, in his capacity of President of the European Union, met with His Holiness in Poland, France was put under a lot of pressure and made a statement that since the time of Charles de Gaulle, France recognized that Tibet was a part of China, which is actually not true, or not accurate, I should say. But that is an example, and that the statement continues by saying, and this will not change. Denmark was pressured to make a similar statement, and Denmark added that the Danish government does not support Tibetan independence. A little bit in the same way as President Obama added that statement as well. I think that addition is even more harmful and completely unnecessary. It takes away and violates the Tibetans' right to self-determination to say that they cannot have any say in their future because we do not support a particular outcome. And again, it reduces the leverage for Tibetans should negotiations take place, this type of statement.
In May, in a May press conference with the Japanese Prime Minister, President Biden said, "I believe what Putin is attempting to do is eliminate the identity of Ukraine, the identity. He can't occupy it, but he can try to destroy its identity." And, you know, I think those words are true with what Putin is trying to do in Ukraine, but I think they're also applicable to what China is trying to do in Tibet. How should we view Tibet through the lens of what President Biden's comment about eliminating the identity of Ukraine? And I will ask you all to respond, and anything that you think we should add for the record, this is the time to make that clear as well. So why don't we begin with Mr. Benoit?
Thank you very much, sir. I think what is happening in the Ukraine, Russia's war with the Ukraine, is bringing home a number of issues that are directly related to Tibet as well. I mean, we are obviously shocked by the blatant aggression against the Ukraine and reminded that exactly the same happened a little over 70 years in relation to Tibet. And President Biden also made a statement to the effect that taking another's territory by force is unacceptable, that it violates fundamental norms of our international order. I couldn't agree more. And I think that should apply to Tibet. In terms of the destruction of the very identity of the Tibetans, and I believe the same is true when we look at the Uyghurs in East Turkestan, it has become very clear, I think, at this point, that the very policy of the PRC and of the Chinese Communist Party is precisely this, to destroy the identity of these peoples, because they have found them to be an obstacle to their full integration in China. And not only that, but they have found that as long as there is a sense of identity in the Tibetan case and in the Uyghur case, both very closely linked to their religious beliefs and traditions, that the CCP will not be able to fully control the Tibetans. This is linked also to the question of the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. It is all of Chinese policies today under Xi Jinping are geared at full and total control of the Tibetans, whether it is through the Dalai Lama by picking him and educating him in accordance with CCP views, or whether it is by taking the children and placing them in this network of colonial schools, or whether it is by suppressing religious freedom and other things as well. So, yes, it is, the intention is to rub Tibet out of the map in terms of the identity and the distinctness of the Tibetan people. As part of that, there is a strong effort to rob the Tibetans also of their history, since that's also tied to their identity and is a continuing embarrassment to China's attempt to continue to rule Tibet.
Slow. The Chinese government, look, I mean, if you want to do something constructive right now, you should re-enter the direct dialogue that you walked away from 12 years ago. This issue is not going away. And so I appreciate everybody being here. I want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony. Without objection, I'd like to enter into the record a written statement from the International Campaign for Tibet and an additional paper by Professor Lau. The record will remain open until the close of business on Friday, June 24th, for any items that members would like to submit for the record or any additional questions for the witnesses. And with that, the hearing is adjourned.